The courtroom fell into a tense silence, every eye fixed on the man stepping toward the bench. Sean Diddy Combs, mogul, icon, billionaire, now stood humbled under the golden seal of justice. Judge Frank Caprio leaned forward, tapping his gavel gently as he locked eyes with the man America thought untouchable. "Mr. Combs," he said, voice calm but resolute, "is it true you orchestrated this entire scheme behind a charitable foundation?" Diddy didn't flinch, but a flicker crossed his face. Then, from the gallery, an unexpected voice rang out. A young woman, no older than 22, stood trembling but defiant. "Your Honor," she said, lifting a thick envelope, "he used me." "And hundreds more like me." Gasps echoed, cameras clicked, and the truth, buried for years beneath glamour and fame, began to unravel before everyone's eyes. Comment where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another unforgettable story from the courtroom. On a brisk spring morning in Providence, the air hung heavy with both chill and anticipation. The familiar buzz of traffic and hurried footsteps was undercut by something else, a quiet hum of excitement that rippled through the block surrounding Municipal Court. Word had traveled fast. This wasn't a routine hearing. This wasn't a parking violation or a citation for an expired meter. The man walking into the courthouse that morning had been on magazine covers, award show stages, and the Forbes list. But today, he was stepping into a very different spotlight. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, drawing a cluster of cautious onlookers and murmuring courtgoers. The door opened slowly. Out stepped Sean Diddy Combs, an icon of music, fashion, and business. But there were no paparazzi, no red carpet, no entourage this time. Just a man in a modest gray suit, tailored yet restrained, and dark sunglasses that masked whatever turmoil might be hiding behind his eyes. He adjusted the collar of his coat as the cold air pressed against him and made his way inside. Inside the courtroom, a hush fell. Even in a room where proceedings were usually brisk and impersonal, people paused. Clerks exchanged glances. The bailiff shifted his stance. A few heads turned from the wooden benches, their eyes following him as he stepped through the doorway. His presence carried weight, not just from fame, but from the reason he was there. Gone was the bravado of Puff Daddy, the swagger of Diddy, the exuberance of a man who once danced in million-dollar music videos. In its place stood a quiet, composed figure, a man whose career had weathered decades, scandals, reinventions, and relentless public scrutiny. But nothing he had faced on a stage or in the press could quite prepare him for the sobering humility of a courtroom. Judge Frank Caprio, beloved for his humanity and wit, lifted his eyes as Diddy stepped forward. The judge, known for treating everyone with dignity regardless of status, didn't flinch at the name or the stature of the man before him. Instead, he offered the same warmth that had defined his bench for years. "Well," Judge Caprio began, a faint grin tugging at the corners of his mouth, "I've had my fair share of celebrities in here, but I think you win for most Grammys." A few restrained chuckles broke through the room's tension. Even Diddy couldn't suppress a slight smile. But it didn't last long. It wasn't nerves or arrogance. It was the weight of something deeper, something unsaid. Behind him, in the rows of benches, sat an eclectic mix of spectators. These weren't journalists or fans hoping for autographs. There was a young woman in a denim jacket, her eyes fixed on the back of his head. An elderly man with a worn expression sat with his hands folded, watching silently. A delivery driver still wearing his work badge leaned forward slightly, as if bracing for what might come next. They weren't there for spectacle. They weren't there for the celebrity. They were there for resolution, for acknowledgement, for truth. Diddy shifted slightly, glancing back briefly before fixing his gaze forward again. He recognized none of them, yet their presence felt as real and confrontational as the charges hanging in the air. It wasn't just about what the court had to say. It was about what these people were hoping to hear. For years, he had commanded stages, boardrooms, and red carpets. But today, he stood on equal footing with every other defendant who'd ever walked through those courtroom doors. Stripped of flash and filtered image, he was just a man before the law, and perhaps more terrifying, before the judgment of strangers who felt affected by his past. The gavel had not yet struck. The trial had not yet begun. But already, the silence in the courtroom spoke volumes. The sharp rap of the gavel rang out, silencing the soft murmurs in the courtroom. Judge Caprio sat upright, his expression measured. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. "The people versus Sean Combs." Diddy remained standing, flanked by his attorney. The weight of the moment seemed to press into his shoulders, though he kept his chin high. The prosecution stepped forward. Maria Hale, the assistant city attorney, was young but formidable. She moved with confidence, a folder of documents tucked under one arm. "Your Honor," she began, her voice firm and clear, "today's proceedings are not about celebrity, notoriety, or headlines. They are about accountability and the pursuit of truth. The defendant, Mr. Sean Combs, is alleged to have grossly misused his nonprofit organization, the Lightworks Fund. We allege that he solicited charitable donations under false pretenses, redirected those funds into offshore accounts, and systematically exploited unpaid interns under the pretense of mentorship and career development." There was a ripple of reaction from the courtroom benches, a few gasps, some murmured disbelief. Diddy didn't flinch. He looked straight ahead, impassive. Judge Caprio raised an eyebrow and leaned forward slightly. "That's quite the list of allegations, Ms. Hale. Mr. Combs, how do you plead?" Diddy stepped forward. His voice was low, controlled. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Judge Caprio gave a small nod, then gestured toward the prosecution. "Proceed." Maria Hale began by submitting a thick stack of documents. "We have a full audit from Forensic Accounting Associates showing significant irregularities within the Lightworks Fund's finances over the last 5 fiscal years. Donations earmarked for community outreach programs in underserved neighborhoods were rerouted into shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands." She clicked a remote, and a screen displayed the audit summary. Line after line of financial discrepancies, shell company names, and offshore transfers. "Additionally," she continued, "we have the testimony of Ms. Leila Brennan, a former intern who was one of many promised educational opportunities and industry experience. Instead, she and others were worked relentlessly, upwards of 14-hour days, without pay, contracts, or recourse. When she raised concerns, she was warned she'd be blackballed from the industry." A hush fell over the courtroom. Leila Brennan, seated near the witness stand, was called forward. She appeared young, early 20s, with tired eyes and a nervous grip on her hands. "I was proud to be selected," she said softly. "It felt like my big break, but it turned into something else. We were expected to handle the workload of full-time employees, often without guidance. And when I asked about compensation or academic credit, I was told I'd be lucky if I was ever allowed to work in music again." Judge Caprio listened attentively, his gaze shifting between the witness and the defendant. He didn't interrupt. Next, Diddy's legal team stood. His lead attorney, Malcolm Rains, was composed, deliberate. "Your Honor," Rains began, "the Lightworks Fund has donated millions to causes across the country, from scholarships to emergency housing relief. We don't deny that administrative errors may have occurred, and we are already conducting our own internal review. But to imply Mr. Combs orchestrated a deliberate scheme for personal gain is simply unfounded." He held up his own stack of documents. These are letters from community leaders, non-profit partners, and beneficiaries of the Lightworks Fund, all attesting to the positive impact the organization has had. Furthermore, Mr. Combs has never drawn a salary from the foundation. The notion that he's exploiting it for financial benefit runs counter to his record of philanthropy. The courtroom was split, some faces skeptical, others reflective. Judge Caprio remained still, his fingers lightly tapping the bench. "Thank you, Mr. Raines," he said finally. "I appreciate the defense's position." He turned to Diddy, regarding him not with disdain, but with a quiet, searching concern. "You know, Mr. Combs," he said thoughtfully, "I've seen plenty of cases where the public image doesn't quite match the private reality. But I've also seen people get caught in the machinery of their own success, unaware of how things run beneath them." The judge's voice softened. "The question isn't just what happened, it's whether you knew. And if you didn't know, why didn't you?" The words hung in the air like a weight, resting heavily on everyone present. Diddy looked down at the table, fingers clasped. For a moment, the courtroom was completely silent. The truth was no longer a matter of public image. It was something far more intimate and far more dangerous. The courtroom sat in tense silence after the back and forth between prosecution and defense, the weight of the allegations pressing down on everyone present. The air felt thick with unresolved tension, as if the case had only just begun to reveal its true gravity. Then, without warning, a slight figure rose from one of the back rows. She moved quietly, almost hesitantly, as if unsure whether she belonged in this space or if she had the right to speak. No one had called her to the stand. No one had invited her voice into the legal storm swirling around Sean Combs. But something deeper, something raw and urgent, pulled her forward. Judge Caprio noticed immediately. He watched her rise and gave a subtle nod of encouragement, his face open and compassionate. "Please, come forward," he said gently. "If you have something to share, the court will hear you." She stepped to the front. Her eyes were downcast, her hands clutching something fragile, a crumpled piece of paper worn from many folds. She was young, barely out of her teens, her voice trembling as she spoke. "My name is Aaliyah Jennings," she said softly, "and I was 19 when I joined the mentorship program at the Lightworks Fund." Her words drew every eye, every ear, pulling the courtroom's attention from the legal arguments to something deeply personal. "I thought it was my chance to learn, to grow, to build a future. I was promised education, career opportunities, real mentorship." She paused, swallowing hard. "But what I got was something very different." A hush fell over the room as she looked up briefly, meeting the gaze of the judge, then shifting toward Diddy. "I was made to clean floors, answer endless phone calls, and bring coffee to boardrooms where men laughed at me, making jokes I couldn't understand. They called it networking, but it felt like humiliation." She took a breath, her voice catching slightly. "My father died while I was working 80 hours a week, unpaid. I couldn't afford a bus ticket to get home to say goodbye. I begged for help, but the program's leaders told me I should be grateful for the experience, that this was my path to success." The crumpled letter she held out was stained and folded, fragile like her words. "This letter," she said, voice cracking, "is from my mother. She wrote it the day after my father passed. I never saw it until I got home." She handed the letter to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Judge Caprio unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the handwritten words, expressions of grief, pleas for help, and quiet sorrow. A soft murmur passed through the courtroom. Faces turned to one another, some with sympathy, others with disbelief. Diddy's expression shifted. For the first time since the proceedings began, The mask of control slipped. His jaw tightened. A flicker of shame, maybe regret, passed across his features. His hands clenched briefly on the edge of the table. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, resting his hand thoughtfully on his chin. He studied Aaliyah, then looked toward Diddy. "This," the judge said quietly, "is the part that doesn't show up on financial reports or legal briefs. These are the faces behind the allegations, the human cost." His voice carried an unmistakable weight. "Mr. Combs, when you built your empire, did you ever think about those like Aaliyah, the ones who may have been overlooked or forgotten in the shadow of success?" Diddy remained silent, the courtroom holding its breath. It was a question without an easy answer, and a moment that seemed to stretch beyond the courtroom walls, into the heart of a man whose public image had long been one of power and influence, now confronted with the quiet pain of those he was meant to uplift. Aaliyah lowered her gaze, tears brimming but unshed, as Judge Caprio's words lingered. This was no longer just a case about money or contracts. It was about accountability, empathy, and the true meaning of leadership. The courtroom sat in stillness, waiting for what would come next. For several long moments, the courtroom seemed suspended in time. The usual hum of movement and whispered conversations had vanished, replaced by a profound stillness that enveloped everyone present. The weight of Aaliyah's testimony lingered in the air, filling the room with a quiet gravity that no legal document or argument could match. Judge Frank Caprio sat quietly, fingers interlaced, eyes fixed on the scattered papers before him. The stacks of tax forms, financial audits, testimonies, and letters seemed to blur together. But beneath the printed words was a deeper truth, one that transcended numbers and legalities. It was a truth about human lives, hopes, and the consequences of actions cloaked in good intentions. After what felt like an eternity, Judge Caprio raised his head. His voice was calm, but carried the unmistakable weight of a man who had spent decades balancing mercy with responsibility. "This court," he began softly, "has always believed in second chances, in the belief that people can learn from their mistakes, grow, and make amends. That's the foundation of justice, not just punishment, but redemption." He paused, his eyes scanning the room, meeting the gazes of the defendant, the prosecution, and the silent observers. But justice, true justice, cannot ignore patterns of harm. It cannot look away when those with power exploit trust, when systems built to help the vulnerable become tools for exploitation. He tapped a finger gently on a financial report in front of him. "I have sentenced children for jumping turnstiles on the subway. I have fined single mothers for expired parking meters. I have watched people struggle to make ends meet, facing consequences that, while small in the eyes of some, carried huge weight for those individuals." The courtroom absorbed his words, the familiar sense of fairness and compassion that defined Judge Caprio's courtroom coming alive in the room. But when people who hold immense power, people with influence, wealth, and status, manipulate those systems for personal gain or to shield wrongdoing, that is a different kind of injustice, a deeper, more troubling betrayal. He looked directly at Sean Combs now. His eyes were kind, but firm. "Mr. Combs, I am not here to humiliate you. That is not the purpose of this courtroom. You are not just a name or a headline here. You are a man, and the law holds you accountable as such." The judge's gaze softened for a moment. "But I cannot ignore what I see. A pattern of harm cloaked in the promise of charity. A system that should uplift, but instead has caused pain. And lives like Aaliyah's remind us that behind every case file and every report, there are real people, young people, who place their trust in good faith." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. The question before this court isn't just about what the law says, but what justice demands. How do we ensure that those who have the means to do good are held to a higher standard? That the promise of charity does not become a shield for neglect or exploitation? The judge's voice grew softer, almost reflective. Power and privilege come with responsibility, and with that responsibility comes the need for transparency, accountability, and above all, compassion. The room remained hushed, the courtroom walls seemingly shrinking around the gravity of his words. Judge Caprio looked again at the defendant. "Mr. Combs, you have built an empire that has influenced millions. That influence can be a force for immense good, but today you are reminded that it can also cast a shadow." He paused, then added quietly, "This court will weigh the evidence carefully, but it also looks to the man behind the empire. How will you answer to those who believed in your promises? How will you reconcile your legacy with the pain left in the wake of this case?" For the first time in the morning, the judge's words seemed to hang as an invitation, a challenge, and a plea, for accountability, for honesty, and perhaps for healing. The courtroom remained still, waiting for the next chapter of this complex story to unfold. The courtroom was just beginning to settle after Judge Caprio's thoughtful reflections, the gravity of the moment still palpable. The case had stretched beyond a simple dispute over funds. It had become a reckoning about power, trust, and responsibility. Yet, everyone braced for what they assumed would be closing remarks, or perhaps a brief recess. Then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, drawing every eye. A woman entered quietly, her expression serious but determined. She wore a plain blouse and carried a small envelope. Without hesitation, she approached the clerk's desk, placed the envelope down, and from within, it pulled a small USB drive. "This just arrived," she said calmly, "sent anonymously by a whistleblower connected to the Lightworks Fund." A hush fell over the room as Judge Caprio looked toward the prosecution and defense, weighing the gravity of the unexpected development. "Very well," the judge said, tapping his pen against the bench. "We will take a short recess to review the contents." The bailiff called a brief pause. Everyone shifted, some whispering among themselves, others staring at the USB drive, now carefully passed from the clerk to the judge's chambers. Inside, a few members of the court staff, along with Attorney Hale and defense counsel, gathered around a computer. The tension was thick as they began to open files, scroll through emails, and play audio recordings. What they found stunned them all. The files included internal emails between Diddy's top aides that revealed a cold, calculated plan to manage the flow of interns and donations. One memo outlined strategies to funnel undesirable applicants, those who might complain or ask for pay, into unpaid work under the radar. Another included detailed bank transfers tracing funds not to community projects, but to offshore accounts tied to shell corporations. More chillingly, there were recorded meetings, captured surreptitiously by the whistleblower. The voices in the recordings were unmistakable. The cadence, tone, and speech patterns confirmed it was indeed the defendant's inner circle. The courtroom returned from recess as Judge Caprio called everyone back to order. He looked at the assembled lawyers and said gravely, "We have reviewed some new evidence that demands attention." The bailiff queued up one of the recordings. The courtroom fell silent as a grainy audio clip played through the speakers. A male voice, unmistakably Sean Combs's, could be heard. "We don't need interns who ask questions," the voice said, cold and clipped. "We need ones who disappear. No trouble, no complaints. Keep it quiet. That's how we protect the brand." A few gasps escaped from the spectators. The defense attorney's face tightened, but there was no immediate objection. The judge looked toward Diddy, who had bowed his head, the weight of the moment settling heavily on him. His fingers clenched and unclenched on the table. Assistant City Attorney Hale rose again, her voice steadier than before, but edged with urgency. Your Honor, this recording corroborates the testimony we've heard from former interns and the financial evidence. It reveals not just mismanagement, but an active effort to suppress complaints and deceive donors and the public. Malcolm Raines, the defense lawyer, stood slowly, face pale but resolute. Your Honor, we intend to examine the authenticity of these recordings and the context surrounding them. We ask for the court's patience before drawing conclusions based on incomplete evidence. Judge Caprio nodded. Fair enough, but make no mistake, this is serious. The court will ensure every piece of evidence is scrutinized. Turning to Diddy, the judge's tone softened slightly, but remained firm. Mr. Combs, this new evidence deepens the questions about your knowledge and involvement. It also underscores the impact on those who trusted this organization. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. In that charged moment, the proceedings transformed. What had begun as a legal case about alleged mismanagement had become a profound examination of ethics, leadership, and the cost of silence. Diddy's bowed head was more than just a gesture. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the shifting tide, one that would test not only the facts, but the character of the man who once stood as an icon of aspiration. The case was far from over. When the courtroom doors opened once more, Judge Frank Caprio returned to the bench, his usual warmth tempered by the solemn weight of the case's revelations. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. Everyone knew this moment was pivotal. Judge Caprio adjusted his glasses and folded his hands on the bench. His gaze swept over the courtroom, lingering for a moment on Sean Combs, who sat quietly, head bowed, but attentive. I'll be honest, Mr. Combs, the judge began, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of sincere reflection. I never imagined I'd see someone of your stature in this courtroom, facing such serious allegations. He paused, the silence amplifying the gravity of his words. But that, Judge Caprio continued, is exactly the point. Fame, fortune, or accolades do not grant immunity from the consequences of our actions. No one, no matter how successful, stands above justice. The judge then turned his gaze toward Aaliyah Jennings, who sat quietly in the courtroom. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, but she visibly straightened at the judge's words. Aaliyah, Judge Caprio said softly, you were failed, not only by the promises made by Mr. Combs's organization, but by the very system meant to protect and uplift you and others like you. He nodded gently toward her. For that, I am truly sorry. Then, returning his attention to the defendant, the judge's voice gained a firmer resolve. After careful consideration of all the evidence, financial documents, witness testimonies, and the disturbing recordings, it is clear that harm was done under the guise of philanthropy. The Lightworks Fund, a beacon of hope for many, became a place where trust was broken, promises were left unfulfilled, and lives were impacted deeply. Judge Caprio glanced again at the stacks of paperwork before him, then looked up. To begin addressing this, I am ordering full restitution to all former interns who were affected by these exploitative practices. This restitution will include not only repayment of unpaid labor, but also interest, recognizing the time and opportunity lost. The courtroom was silent, absorbing the weight of the judgment. In addition, the judge continued, the Lightworks Fund will be placed under independent audit and temporary receivership. This is to ensure transparency and to restore faith in an institution that has the power to do immense good, if properly guided. He softened his tone, offering a glimpse of his belief in redemption. I believe people can change. This court is not just about punishment, but about accountability and growth. Therefore, I am granting you, Mr. Combs, an opportunity to make amends beyond financial restitution. Judge Caprio's eyes held a steady compassion. You will undertake community service focused on direct engagement with those you have hurt. It's not enough to simply write checks. True repair comes from listening, learning, and acting with humility. He paused, ensuring his message was clear. Furthermore, you will be required to publicly speak about ethical leadership in business and philanthropy. This is not a chance for PR spin or image management. It is a mandate for truth, an honest reckoning with the consequences of your decisions, and a commitment to lead differently moving forward. For the first time, Sean Combs looked up, nodding quietly. His expression was sober, contemplative. There were no grand gestures or statements, just a humble acceptance of the court's terms. Judge Caprio closed the session with a final, thoughtful reflection. Justice is not only about holding people accountable for what they've done wrong, he said, but about creating space for healing, for change, and for hope. The courtroom remained still, the echo of those words settling deep into every soul present. In this moment, the law met mercy, firm but fair, stern but compassionate. As the gavel struck, it wasn't just a symbol of judgment, but a call for responsibility, growth, and a new path forward. The case had reached its resolution, not just through the law, but through the shared humanity of all involved. As the courtroom gradually emptied, the buzz of whispered conversations and shuffling feet filled the air. Yet, amid the usual hustle and bustle, there was an unmistakable sense that something significant had transpired, a moment of reckoning that transcended the usual dichotomy of victory or defeat. It was something more complex, more human. Sean Combs did not leave the courthouse in handcuffs, nor was he subjected to the public disgrace some might have expected. Instead, he walked out a changed man, humbled, confronted by the consequences of his actions, and perhaps embarking on a new path. The stoic expression he wore masked a quiet transformation that only those who have faced such trials could truly understand. The dozens of victims, young interns and hopefuls like Aaliyah Jennings, finally had their moment in the light. Their stories, once buried beneath layers of power and influence, were heard and acknowledged. For many, this was not just about restitution of unpaid wages or formal apologies. It was about validation, about reclaiming dignity in the face of exploitation. It was a rare moment where the scales of justice tipped toward empathy and acknowledgement. Judge Frank Caprio watched it all with a familiar, steady gaze, a gaze shaped by decades of experience presiding over cases both small and monumental. For him, this was yet another chapter in his lifelong pursuit of justice that is not merely procedural, but profoundly human. To Judge Caprio, justice is not a spectacle. It isn't about flashy headlines or media soundbites. It's about healing fractured lives, restoring trust where it has been broken, and holding people accountable in ways that encourage true growth. The courtroom may seem a place of finality, but for him, it's often the beginning of change. In this case, that change was not just for one man or one organization. It was a broader message to those who wield power, wealth, and influence. Your true legacy is not built in boardrooms, in contracts, or even in the awards you collect. It's built in the lives you touch, the people who place their faith in you, the communities you claim to serve, and the honesty with which you conduct yourself. The verdict and the judge's ruling echoed beyond the walls of the Providence Municipal Court. It became a reminder that philanthropy and leadership require transparency and ethics, that promises to uplift must be more than just words, and that when systems fail, it is the duty of those in power to step up, not hide behind legal defenses. For Sean Combs, this was a reckoning, an opportunity to reconcile his public image with his private responsibilities. For the victims, it was a small but significant victory in a long struggle. For the community, it was a moment of hope that even the most daunting challenges can be met with fairness and compassion. And for Judge Frank Caprio, it was another reaffirmation of why he takes his seat on that bench every day. Because real justice is never easy. It demands patience, empathy, and sometimes courage. It calls for looking beyond the surface to the heart of human experience. As the courtroom lights dimmed and the doors closed behind the last of the attendees, the story remained, a story of accountability, redemption, and the ongoing journey toward a more just world. In the end, justice was not just served, it was lived. Some courtroom stories are louder than others, but they all matter. Today's case showed us the price of silence and the power of truth. What would you have done in Judge Caprio's place? Do you think the sentence was fair? Comment your thoughts below. We read everyone. And if you believe justice should be compassionate, wise, and courageous, don't forget to subscribe and share this video. There are more stories to come, and every voice makes a difference.